Okay, welcome to Rapid Fire Animal Behavior. The study of the animal behavior is called ethology, just in case you needed to know. So there's four basic questions to understand any animal behavior. The first is, what is the cause? What is the stimulus that causes this behavior? What is the development, or how does the behavior develop? Was an organism born with that, meaning it was innate, or was it a learned behavior? Function and adaptive value. So, how does this behavior affect the fitness? In other words, does this behavior help the organism survive and have higher reproductive success? And then we have phylogeny. How did the behavior evolve? Do other related organisms or ancestors of this animal have it? When was there a random mutation that somehow caused this mutation that helped it have this adaptive value? So, animal behavior that is really defined as a change in the activity of an organism in response to a stimulus. And those stimulus can either be internal, such as circadian rhythm, or thirst and hunger, or pheromones. Often those are caused by the endocrine system and hormones being sent throughout the body through the circulatory system. You can also have external cues from the environment, such as um, low snowfall, food sources, etc. And those can cause behaviors such as hibernation, estivation, where organisms try to get away from the very, very hot, dry environments, and animal migration, which we see in caribou in Alaska and a lot of birds. Natural selection really shapes behavior, right? So again, it's all about finding or having an adaptation that was caused by a random mutation, but somehow that random mutation allowed for some sort of increased fitness and reproductive success, meaning it's an adaptation, right? Um, so some examples of those are some of these behaviors that increased their animals' adaptations or increased the natural selection are, for example, baby birds instinctively opening their mouths to get food. That helps their success. Mother geese instinctively roll their eggs back into the nest in case if they fall out, thereby increasing its reproductive success. And zebra finches, in particular the males, have a heritable tendency to learn a song that will help obtain a mate, right? So that's again helping their reproductive success. Animal behaviors are defined as a change in the activity of an organism in response to some sort of internal or external cue, like we just spoke about. These behaviors can be innate, such and meaning they're genetically hardwired and they're inherited from the parents. They don't have to learn anything. It's in their genes, such as a spider building a web, dolphins leaping, birds building a nest, human babies suckling, and caterpillars making a cocoon. The other type of behavior is a learned behavior, meaning these are not inherited. They are developed throughout the organism's lifetime from experience and environmental influence. Some examples of that are learning a new language, any sort of dog agility training. I think a lot of you have probably had your dog learn to shake or roll over. Those are learned behaviors. Birds feeding on a bird feeder in your yard, goldfish going up to the tank when you have your hand near for food, and then the dreaded seagulls eating food at the beach, which we've all experienced. So, some of the types of innate behaviors are reflex actions, which are very simple innate behaviors, such as the knee jerk reflex, which we spoke about in the nervous system, and the suckling response for babies, suckling reflex. Another type of innate behavior are called, they have to do with motility, and they're called kinesis and taxis. Right? So kinesis is the undirected movement of an organism, whereas taxis is really the very directed movement in response to a stimulus. Both of these are in response to a stimulus, it's just whether it's undirected as in kinesis or directed as in taxis. And then we have a series of actions that can be triggered by a stimulus, and this is called a fixed action pattern. And I discussed this above about a mother goose. If her egg falls out of or rolls out of the nest, then it has an instinctive behavior where it will extend the neck to the egg, go over the egg, and then roll that back in. So it's a series of events due to a very specific stimulus. But this is an innate behavior. The organism is born with these. You can also have types of learned behaviors. So one of them is habituation, where a simple learned behavior kind of slows down or stops after repeated stimulus. All right, so an example are crows in a cornfield. They see a scarecrow and they're like, oh God, what is that terrifying thing? But then after exposure to that, they're like, oh, it's not going to do anything to us. We'll just hang out. So if you look at the response strength over time, it will go down with habituation. Another learned behavior is called imprinting. This is a specialized learning during a very brief period in an organism's life, and only certain organisms have this. But a really famous example, I think his name is Conrad something. And he did experiments, behavioral experiments with birds, showing that he could get birds to imprint on him, meaning the birds thought that he was their mother and they would follow him around. And it was a learned behavior. Two that you're probably more familiar with. One is classical conditioning, where a new stimulus is associated with some pre-existing response. So for example, before conditioning, if you have food, dogs will salivate, right? Before conditioning, if you ring a bell, the dog has no correlation of what that bell means and you get no salivation. During conditioning, every time you bring the dog food, you ring a bell. Every time you bring food, ring a bell, right? And they learn that the bell is associated with food. So therefore, if you then take away the food and you ring the bell, the dog will salivate. That is a classical conditioning experiment. An operant conditioning is when a learned behavior, animals learn a behavior through either reward or punishment. So, for example, in a lot of college psychology classes, they have students train rats, right, to push a lever to get food. So this is a learned behavior. They get a reward every time they push the lever, and then they learn to do that. Another, for example, operant conditioning that a lot of you have probably experienced is that making your dog not pee inside the house, right? You give them a punishment, and then you give them a reward for peeing outside. So. Okay, you can look at this chart obviously to get a little more details about classical versus operant conditioning. The main ones, classical are involuntary, right? Whereas operant are voluntary, and then they have different roles about the timing. Classical conditioning, you're preceding the stimulus. Operant, you're doing it after. You're either punishing or rewarding after that. And the timing of the response, classical conditioning is after, and here it's before the stimulus. All right, so animal communication. There are many, many types of animal communication and different signals. So a few of them are pheromones, which are chemical signals such as ants. Humans also have pheromones. Dogs have pheromones, often in their anal glands. There's also auditory clues, such as sounds from a bird or croaking or monkeys. There's visual cues, looking. So for example, the red behind in some monkeys signals that it's time for a mating season. Other visual cues, such as facial expressions, smiling, frowning, crying, and then also visual cues such as this frog, these bright, bright colors saying, yo, I'm dangerous to eat, please don't eat me. And then there's a lot of tactile cues as well, such as monkeys grooming, bees doing a very clear dance, and then the suckling in many mammals. There's a lot of very complex learned behaviors as well. One type is observational learning. This is a form of social learning, takes place through observation. This is almost everything that humans do, right? Brushing their teeth, learning to take a bath, learning the new TikTok dance. This is my favorite picture ever because he looks so happy. Anyway, and then we have insight learning. This is when you're not trying things over and over again. Rather, a light bulb goes off and there's an aha moment. So many of us have had that experience taking a shower and just had a thought off the top of our head. And that's called insight learning, really, right? And really, only higher order organisms, such as monkeys, gorillas, humans, have those types of insight learning. That's a really complex, and that has to do with the brain development in the frontal cortex. There's also foraging behavior, such as searching for wild food sources, and we see this with herds, flocks, schools, pods. There's lots of different ways that you can forage for food, and we see with packs with predation as well. And I want to point out that humans also have done foraging behavior, in particular in our distant past. There's also social behaviors such as aggression or submission, and we've all heard of the alpha dog versus the beta dog. These are agnostic behaviors. There's a dominance hierarchy, power and social relationships within organisms. You've also probably heard of like a lion's pride, and how lions work together, but there's definitely a clear dominance hierarchy. There's also territoriality, defensive territory, and you may have seen that with dogs on your lawn, kind of barking to get intruders away. And then altruistic behavior, or unselfish behavior in order to save the species. There's a lot of strange animal behaviors that a lot of you discussed during your movies as well.